From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Jason Staples bringing you Unconquered with Doc Staples. As always, this podcast brought to you by EPR Creations, bringing you the best of website development and internet marketing for an affordable price. By Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida. By Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. By Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida. And by Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. If you're in one of those states and you are not getting your mortgage through Benchmark Mortgage and Justin Galloway, oh baby, what is you doing? All right, well, it is time for our Midseason Mailbag. And boy, is the mailbag full right now. I've got so much to get through, so really not going to belabor this. Going to do my best to get through as many questions and such, and as much fodder for discussion as possible on this. So without further delay, let's go ahead and get to it. First question. Should Luke Cromanhook get equal reps with Brock Glenn versus Duke? And do you think one of Glenn or Luke Cromanhook transfers? And do you prefer Luke over Brock next year as the starting quarterback? Wow, there are lots of layers to this, and I'm not going to be able to do this full justice. Now, first of all, the question of equal reps against Duke. I'm of the view that, you're already playing a young guy. I think you have to do what you think is most likely to lead to winning the game, first and foremost. So if, based on practice reps and everything else and how things are grading out, you believe that Brock Glenn is giving you the best opportunity to win that game on the road on Friday night, then he should take reps until certain struggles happen. He should be considered to be taking the majority. Now, it may be close enough that you decide, okay, all things being equal, if the flow of the game allows it, we're going to look at drive 3 or 4. We're going to look at giving Luke a look and seeing what the offense looks like under the lights with him in there. And you give him a couple series. And if he then goes out and plays better than what you had from Brock Glenn in those first 3 drives, say, then, at that point you have to play that by ear. But I don't think that you should come into this one, unless they've been just playing each other to pretty close to a dead heat in practice. I don't think you come into this one and say, okay, we're just going to split reps down the middle and each of you is going to get half. I don't think that's a good way to manage the quarterback position, where so much is about rhythm and learning to maneuver the team and all of those other things. So, I don't think that, but I do think it would be best for the program in terms of long-term if Luke started getting some reps and started getting some opportunities to get a drive here and there. And again, ideally the flow of the game allows that. That's the question. But, if it's a 10-0 game after 2 drives, and the third drive, all of a sudden Brock Glenn starts to settle in and get comfortable, and then it's 10-3, and then the fourth drive you're backed up inside your 5-yard line. Maybe that's not the opportunity that you want to do, that you want to saddle your true freshman quarterback with. Maybe that's not the best time. You have to take care of all those things as the flow of the season and the game demand. Now, in terms of, do I think one of Glenn or Cromanhook transfer? I don't think anybody can answer that question with any sort of certainty. I do think that given today's the contours of college football today, if you have 2 quarterbacks, one of whom is a redshirt freshman and one is a true freshman, and one of them believes that he is no longer in line to really win that job, odds are pretty good that the guy who doesn't believe he's in line to win the job is going to transfer. So if I'm just answering that off of just the way that the college game has worked for a while, I would be surprised if within the next year and a half, one of those guys doesn't transfer. Now, if you're talking about transferring before the 2025 season or before the spring, I don't think it's impossible. I might even put as high a percentage on it as 20 or 25% that, one of them transfers out before the spring. I don't know that I'd put it quite that high, but it's non-zero that one of them transfers out even before the spring. But I think you've got to sell them on spring as a competition to see who's going to win in 2025. You have to sell them on that. Now, what makes this even trickier is what happens if suddenly through the back channels you discover that a seasoned and really proven quarterback decides he wants in. What do you do? What happens if one of those guys who's going into maybe his junior year next year and has a year or two of starting experience under his belt and has proven himself at this level, that becomes really hard to turn down, especially given this year. But then if you do take that guy, you're pretty certainly going to lose one of these guys, probably immediately thereafter, or even if you have that guy visit, probably lose one of them, if not both of them. So, it is so much harder to manage the quarterback position in college football now than it ever used to be, because it used to be that you'd sign a guy and you'd expect him to be on your roster for a minimum of 3 or 4 years, because transferring was difficult and came with a significant cost. Now that you have unlimited transfers, guys can just play musical chairs until they find the place that actually they have a starting spot in. So I don't think it's a zero chance that one of these guys decides to transfer out before the spring. And knowing that, the other thing that you have to do is you have to determine, son, are you actually looking at this? And if that guy's potentially looking at transferring, then maybe you have to go in and get somebody from the outside. Or do you think that the couple guys you're bringing in from the freshman class for next year are good enough to actually man that number 2 and number 3 slot? And of course you have Trevor Jackson too. So, like I said, I think it's just much more complicated than it used to be. And, I don't envy the coaches who have to figure this stuff out. Now, I do envy their pocketbooks, that much. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You could pay me for some of their problems. Sure. Now, the next question is, do I prefer Luke over Brock next year as the starting quarterback? My view on that is that Kromenhoek has significantly higher ceiling as a starter in the future than Glenn. I mean, I think Glenn has, he's shown already that he can be a decent quarterback at this level and potentially grow into a good one. I think Kromenhoek, in terms of as an athlete, in terms of his potential, in terms of the making big time throws, that sort of thing, I think he has more potential than Glenn. So if we're looking at next year and, maybe the growth curve starts to catch up because Luke came in more raw with fewer reps at the quarterback position in high school and so on. Maybe by next year, the other aspects have narrowed enough that, it's sort of a Jake Coker, Jameis Winston type thing where, yeah, you'd rather have Jameis over Jake. And what I said back then, you can go back and listen to that before the 2013 season. My take on that is if you have two guys who are pretty close to equal in practice, but one guy has higher upside, and especially if that one guy is younger than the guy that he's close to equal with, then you favor the young guy. That's just my tendency there. So I don't think that question can be answered without a little bit more data in terms of who would actually be better. But I do think that the overall upside and potential of Kromenhoek, almost said Altmaier, of Luke Kromenhoek is higher. So that's where I come down on that. Now, the next question is directly related to this, and that is, over the course of the next 6 games, do you play both of these quarterbacks equally? Again, I don't think you can go in and say we're just going to do it equally, but I do think that over the next 6 games, you have to get both quarterbacks reps. You have to see enough of both quarterbacks, and that means giving Kromenhoek enough reps to actually get a feel for where he is in games. I think and also to get him in the mindset that he is actually in an active competition for next year. I think you have to do that over the next 6 games. Again, you try not to do that at the expense of potentially winning those games. You're trying to do both here. But you already have a full-scale youth movement happening on this roster, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I do think you're going to see both quarterbacks at different points in different games over the course of the season. And if at any point FSU can actually get a lead, I think you're definitely going to see Kromenhoek go out there with some opportunities to introduce himself and show what he can do. No question. Now, I continue to get question after question on whether or not Mike Norvell is going to be willing to make the changes necessary after this season, or is he just going to be soft and keep his, what I keep seeing is people saying, is he going to be willing to fire his buddies? Well, first thing I want to point out is that the coaches on this staff are not a bunch of Mike Norvell's buddies. I don't know where that notion came from. He didn't hire a bunch of his buddies with this staff. He brought Fuller with him from Memphis, which made sense given the situation and all of that. But Fuller had coached with him all of 1 year at Memphis. 1. These are not buddy guys. Secondly, you look at Atkins. He had never coached with Atkins before. You look at Ron Dugans. Ron Dugans was already on staff. You look at Odell Higgins. He was already on staff. Randy Shannon came in from the outside. They had never coached together. Papuchis, they had never coached together. He was hired from the outside. You go down the list, and these are guys that are not from Norvell's specific tree. They're not guys who are buddies with Norvell. Tokars had coached tight ends at Memphis previously and came over as an analyst. So some more connection there. You also had some connection within the tree to Thompson and Yak. Those 2 guys you could maybe highlight as the closest to buddies. And then, of course, Surtain is a guy that was hired last year from the outside. These are not a bunch of buddies. And frankly, I think Florida State would be better off if Mike Norvell had been able to hire more of his buddies. If you look at the success of Mike Norvell's coaching tree and guys who coached under Mike Norvell, guys that he coached as players or that, coached with him and all of that, those guys are all having tremendous success right now. Look at Arizona State. Look at UNLV. There's a bunch of these places. Look at Memphis. There are a bunch of these places that are having a lot of success. And if Mike Norvell could just get more of his buddies on staff, it probably would be a good thing. So first of all, I don't think that's going to be an obstacle, the buddy problem. Secondly, I think Norvell is at Florida State to win football games. And he will make the decisions that he feels are necessary to win football games. And some of that is going to require making some changes. I think that's obvious at this point. I think that's obvious to him and to everybody else. I'm just going to be candid here. I would be surprised if after this season, there were fewer than, say, I'll just be conservative and say 3 significant coaching changes on the coaching staff. And I think it's going to be more than that, but I would be very surprised if it was fewer than 3 significant changes. And I think Norvell is going to go out and hire guys that he thinks are first rate and that he has some knowledge of or connection to from the past or from people who've worked with him, who've worked with them, that sort of thing. I think that if nothing else, I would expect that Norvell goes back closer to his own coaching tree, even pulling guys from the tree, from underneath guys who are from his tree. So a guy who coached under him before, who's now somewhere else, maybe Mike goes and hires somebody like that. Either way, I think you're going to see him go back more towards his tree than what you have on the current staff. That's my guess. And for what it's worth, I think if he does that, it probably will result in a pretty significant turnaround pretty quickly, because I think you're going to get more synergy very quickly with some very good coaches that are likely to be brought in there. So I do think that that's something that should be considered in all of this. And the like I said, the buddy problem is not an issue, and I think Norvell is likely to be willing to make those decisions. And I think that there are going to be some people from the broader Norvell tree who are going to want in and have an opportunity to help turn that program around. No doubt. Okay, next question. So, I've thought further about your accountability podcast from a week ago. Because of that, I decided to go back and watch the first half of the Dublin game against Georgia Tech. May watch the second half tomorrow. We'll see. Defense played below their abilities, but well enough to allow you to win the game. A lot of their issues in the opening game was bad personnel choices. The offensive line played fairly effectively in the first half. Not great, but okay. It's actually hard to believe it's the same offensive line personnel that has played pretty much ever since. I'll be honest, it's almost like that opening game loss broke this team, or something happened after the game behind the scenes over in Dublin that caused them to spiral a bit. The effort and product the entire team put on the field the following week versus Boston College was atrocious, and they've never fully recovered since. Truly the weirdest season in FSU history that I've ever observed. I think that's actually pretty astute. And I need to go back and take a closer look at some of that myself. But that does jive with sort of my initial impressions, is that it didn't feel like things were that far off in Dublin. That Georgia Tech team is actually a pretty good football team, and they should have won that game. They were in position to, with just you had a couple bad throws, a couple of misses that ultimately led to that game getting away from them. But then the next game, I think part of what happened against Boston College is that they were jet lagged. I think that was a factor. And I do wonder about what happened after that game in Dublin. I do think that the overall body language of the team changed. Something happened in that sense. I don't have enough inside knowledge on that to be able to tell you yay or nay on that. And I'm not sure that anybody outside of a few offices actually does. But I do think that it is evident that something changed after that in terms of the sense of the season, in terms of the body language of the team, in terms of the belief that they had. Something just didn't go right. Now, I do think the point about the personnel was a really good one. And that's something that I've talked about since Fuller first came on campus. Especially on the defensive side, I've been baffled at times by the way that certain defensive personnel has been employed, especially early in seasons. I mean, when they came in and Amari Gaynor was moved to where he got moved right away, I was like, that guy can't play there. That's not where he's native. And why are you lining this guy up over? Like there was a lot of that. If you go back to those 2019 podcasts. I'm talking about that. I thought that they did a poor job of evaluating personnel and where they should put them. I mean, I was adamant that the best corner on that team was probably Renardo Green, and he's at safety. Why is he at safety? I don't know. There was a lot of that. And I think that continues to be a problem, and that was a problem early this year. And I think now what's interesting is that the depth chart that we just saw released is the closest thing to guys across the board playing in proper position that we've seen. Go figure. It only took 6 games. That leads us to the next question. So, linebacker question. Since you have knowledge of both UNC and FSU coaching, I saw Amari Gaynor, speaking of Gaynor, made the Raiders roster. FSU had him behind Bethune and Deloach. Was he not being used properly at Florida State, or did he just get that much better coaching at UNC and took a huge leap? Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that Gaynor didn't actually start at North Carolina either. after he transferred to North Carolina. He was a situational edge guy at North Carolina and did not even play linebacker. He was an edge guy. And the reason that he played there and the reason that he ended up behind both Bethune and Deloach at Florida State is that the instincts as a backer really have always been a bit of a problem for Gaynor. He's always been a better player moving forward than he has playing in space, asking him to read, doing some of those things. Terrific athlete, though. 230 pounds, runs 4.5, jumps out of the gym. Unreal athlete. And also an amazing special teams player, which is, I'm pretty sure, the main reason that he made that Raiders roster. The reason that he's out there is that on a 53-man NFL roster, the ability to be a dynamic and excellent special teams player holds more value than it does for a guy on a 85-man scholarship roster in college. When you're looking at the NFL, you've got 22 starters, and because there aren't as many plays in an NFL game, you're looking at usually somewhere around 60, 62, 65 plays in an NFL game. Most of those starters play most of the game. And their backups had better be able to do something else really well, or they're probably not going to make the roster. So you're either a starter or you're a really good special teams player, because that's 22 players plus your specialists, your kicker, your long snapper, and your punter. So that's 25 of your 53 that are starters. Then you're going to have to get your 3 or 4 offensive linemen who are your primary active roster offensive linemen. Now you're at 30. So now you have 23 players. That's the remainder essentially of your 2 deep that you have to figure out where they are situated. 2 of those are going to be your number 2 and 3 quarterbacks. So now you're at 22 players. So now you have the remainder of your 2 deep depth chart that is in the mix. And essentially, if you show that you're a really good special teams player, you're probably going to carve out a role as that, let's say you're the 6th linebacker and you're competing with another backer to make the active roster, or the 5th linebacker. The 5th linebacker is probably not going to play that much on defense. He might get 10 snaps, and that might be overstating it, but he's going to get 10 snaps on special teams. And if he's that much better on special teams, that guy's going to be the guy. And that's what Amari Gaynor brings to the table. Is he's a terrific athlete who brings length and speed and size and all of those things to special teams. And he was always a really good special teams player at both places. But no, this was not about coaching at linebacker, especially since he didn't play linebacker at UNC. All right. Next question. So this is, given the enormity of the impending rebuild, as well as the dramatic loss of goodwill among donors and fans, do you think there's a chance Norvell takes an escape hatch to Arkansas, Ole Miss, assuming Kiffin leaves for UF, or some other Power 4 job? First of all, there's no Power 4. There's just Power 3. So if so, who's on your short list of replacements? Thanks for, etc. So I don't think there's any chance that Norvell pulls the ripcord. That first of all would be admitting defeat. And you got to understand, these guys are not built for that. These are highly competitive alpha males who do not like to lose. And if he pulls the ripcord and goes somewhere else, that's always going to kind of taint him. The second thing is, if he pulls the ripcord and goes somewhere else, it costs him money. There are a lot of reasons. There are millions of reasons, tens of millions of reasons for him to stay. So, yeah, I don't see that happening. And I don't think there's any real reason to have a short list of replacements for something that I think has less than, say, a 2% or 1% chance of happening. I think what's much more likely to happen than him pulling the ripcord is for him to go out and hire the absolute best guys that he can hire and say, you know what, we're going to go full all in, fully weaponized mode here in a way that maybe I couldn't before. And we're going to get this right. I think that's what we're going to see. And I think you're going to see significant changes basically at every level of the organization. Next question. Are you overall satisfied with the FSU strength program overall? I watch top SEC teams and they just look bigger and badder across the board. Maybe they start with a better lump of clay than FSU, but I just don't see the mass on our boys. Yes, we have workout freaks like Verse and Benson, but when our lines get no push, the wide receivers are skinny and can't block, the running backs break no tackles. Heck, look at our quarterbacks. Tate was a string bean, Travis is small, etc. They get hurt easily, yet all I hear is body by storms. So no strength, lots of injuries. Does he have a share in the blame? I truly hope Norvell leaves no stone unturned. So that's a great question. So first of all, Josh Storms and his staff are, in my view, excellent. And if you look at what they bring to the table, Storms and his staff are extremely well respected and very well credentialed. These are not guys who are just meatheads who are asking guys to go out and, throw a barbell around or just, figuring stuff out. They've got an entire team of strength and conditioning guys that know their stuff. And if you compare Florida State's strength and conditioning staff, credential for credential, with other staffs around the country, they're going to match up with just about anybody. In fact, I would venture to say with anybody. And if you ask around the country, Storms has respect and his staff have respect. So, and then beyond that, a lot of people don't understand that in the strength and conditioning side of things, it's not like there's a magic, there's like a magic workout program that you can do that some SEC programs have figured out and just haven't filtered down to guys like Josh Storms. It's not the case. Every major program in the country essentially does the same sets of exercises, works through lots of similar periodization and all of those things. I guarantee you, if you go to Alabama and you watch them go through their workouts in the spring and in the summer and into the season and all of that, and then you compared what Florida State does, you're going to see the same sets of exercises, very similar arrangements, all of that, because it's just state of the art. It's everybody does what works, what has been shown to work best. There's a lot of evidence-based stuff. And Josh Storms and his whole staff are well credentialed. They're well educated. They're on top of the cutting edge of where all this stuff goes and where it's going on the strength and conditioning side. This is not a situation where, like with Willie Taggart, you had, strength staff that were under credentialed and just kind of work by the seat of their pants. That's not what you have at Florida State. The biggest difference is flat out recruiting. If you look at somebody, look at Ohio State right now. Look at Ohio State's wide receivers and look at Florida State's wide receivers and you go, well, yeah, look at those guys. They're skinny. Florida State's receivers are skinny and can't block. Why is it that they're like that? Well, Florida State didn't recruit and land Jeremiah Smith. Jeremiah Smith showed up on campus looking like Tarzan. He showed up looking like that. I learned this the hard way when I went to Florida State, and I arrived over optimistic for what a walk-on should really be thinking. I was really convinced that hard work really would overcome whatever other disadvantages that I might have brought to the table. And then I saw Greg Jones, who is a fellow freshman, who is the third freshman on campus. I and Michael Boulware were the first two freshmen from our class to arrive in the summer of 2000. And, Mike was a pretty amazing athlete already at 18 years old and was, a lot faster than me. He was bigger, longer wingspan, stronger than I was. But, I didn't feel like that he was just completely out of reach in that sense. That was not the feel that, that I had, even though in hindsight, I probably should have had that feel. But, it was like, okay, well, I can at least, I'll be able to compete and give me a few years to continue to develop, and I'll be able to compete with guys like that. And then Greg Jones showed up. And when Greg showed up, it was like, oh, that's different. You don't look like that. Like, you're not supposed to look like that at 18 years old. You're not supposed to run and move like that with that kind of body mass at that age. But the guy's the nephew of Joe Frazier. And by the way, one of the nicest human beings you'll ever meet. I love Greg Jones. But I remember him showing up to the practice fields one day, and Winky looks at him and goes, "Hey, man, hey, freshman," introduces himself again, reacquaint himself. He says, you want to run the miles out of your legs a little bit, go ahead and join us. We were doing some, 7-on-7 and 1-on-1 stuff out there on the fields. And Big G just, peeled off and got ready to go. And every one of us just like, dang, man, you recruit guys like that. And honestly, I or you or, half of the listening audience of this podcast could go out there as strength and conditioning guys, read a couple books and assign, some exercises for the day. And they're going to go out there and look like they just got off prison cell block D. Because some guys you recruit that. That's just the way it is. And again, that's not to say that strength and conditioning isn't really important. You can and you do get guys stronger. You can and you do have them doing all of these prehab exercises to minimize soft tissue injuries and knee injuries and all of those things. You can and must inculcate a culture of work and strain and all of those things that are produced in the fires of off-season conditioning. But the reality is, like, you're not winning the Kentucky Derby on a mule, y'all. If you look at those teams that look a little bit different, I can promise you that the players that they got when they were 18, the players on that roster looked different than the other players that you're comparing them to when they were 18. That's just reality. And like I said, I had to learn that. And it became pretty clear to me eventually. Took a while. I'm a slow learner on some of this stuff, but it became clear after a while that, like, I just didn't have the goods to develop into that, no matter how hard I worked. I remember Stanford Samuels telling me, man, if you had the talent of PK or Crow, you'd be a first-round pick, but you don't. And they don't work like you. Well, those guys still played in the NFL. Because they had that kind of talent. Now, how long your NFL career is depends a lot, oftentimes, on whether or not you end up working like I did. But I wasn't making the NFL. See, that's the difference. So, I lasted all of 2 years. And eventually, I got called down by Billy Sexton, who told me, son, with your grades and everything else, you're going to go pro in something other than sports. And, it's probably best to start thinking about that earlier rather than later and, protect your head. And I'd had 5 concussions by that point. I got another one after doing something else, but I'd had 5 concussions by that point. So, I mean, he was right, but the reality is I was not that. And like I said, when you're comparing the biggest and baddest rosters in the country, for the most part, what you're dealing with is recruiting. And that's both in high school and in the transfer portal. But the raw material that the strength and conditioning staff has to work with is the most important thing. Now, the thing is, you can look like Tarzan and still play like Jane, which gets us to some of the other questions. So let's get to that. Early in the year, Coach Norvell stated, "This is the strongest offensive line I've ever had." And he actually said the strongest and fastest roster I've ever had, just to fill that in, or something close to that statement. How did he miss the evaluation of the O-line, or did he not just not pay attention and made a blanket statement? I don't want to say lie. Secondly, does Daryl Jackson, well, I'll do the next one. I'll just answer that one first, and then I'll do the next one. So, strongest and fastest roster and strongest offensive line, those are numerically verifiable measurements. That's quantitative stuff. I bet you, I would be surprised if it were not true, that this year's offensive line, if you just look at them, it would be shocking if they did not lift more weight in the weight room than any offensive line that Mike Norvell has had. You got a bunch of guys out there that actually look the part, that have the body mass, that have the, the bubble in the butt. They've got the, the thick thighs and tree trunk type stuff, big arms. These are big guys and they can lift a lot of weight. I guarantee you those guys lift well in the weight room. But that doesn't make you a good football player. So I could go into another story from when I was my brief playing career. There was a guy, another walk-on actually, who went by the name Zeus. Some of y'all listening to this might have known him and might have run into him 25 years ago on campus. But this guy he looked almost Greg Jones-ish. He was basically a bodybuilder, came out, decided, he was going to try to play football, whatever. And he went out there on kickoff coverage and he was put to sleep. He got knocked cold his first rep of kickoff coverage. And Todd Williams, rest his soul, one of my best friends for years, Todd Williams famously in the film session shouts out or, belts out, "No longer am I calling him Zeus." And, goes on from there. But again, that guy lifted more weight in the weight room than basically everybody else on the roster who played his position, but he was nowhere near the football player of those guys. So what Mike Norvell did not say coming into this season is that this is the best team or the best set of football players that I've had. What he did is he talked about the weight room numbers and speed numbers. This is the fastest and strongest team I've had. He didn't say they're the smartest team. They didn't say they had the best football IQ. He didn't say I've got the best set of football players I've ever had. Didn't say that. He talked about the numbers. And if you look at the wide receivers, you got guys that have run 10-4, 10-5, 10-6. You got running backs who've run 10-5, 10-6. You got a lot of strength and speed on this team. And in terms of the on the hoof test, looking at what those guys look like, this looks like a lot of those teams in the SEC. There's a reason that Nick Saban in the opener, when he was evaluating, he walks in, looks at Florida State's roster and says, that's a top 5 roster. Because a lot of those guys do look the part. They may not be Georgia. They may not be quite to Alabama level in terms of the bodies on that roster, but there aren't a whole lot of teams that look bigger and stronger and faster on the hoof. The real problem, and this gets back to, and this is why I put these questions together, the real problem is not strength and conditioning. It's not speed and strength. The problem is that you've got a bunch of guys on this team who aren't good football players. And a bunch of guys on this team who, in certain respects, haven't been coached or coordinated especially well. There's an old saying, 4-5 the wrong direction is slow. It doesn't matter if you run 4-4. 4-4 going the wrong way is slower than a 4-8 going the right direction. And this team has a lot less of that in terms of the football players. Your Tatum Bethune, who's never going to light the stopwatch on fire, or your Kalen DeLoach, who's 20 pounds underweight, but those guys get there and they do their job and they do it great. They don't have as many of those guys on this roster. And the thing is, those guys punch above their weight and above their weight room numbers and above their stopwatch numbers because they're good football players. And by the way, going back to, Jordan Travis being skinny and all of that, Travis has a condition that basically makes it so that it's harder for him to maintain weight. This staff actually figured out, and you can go back to pre-2022 when I talked about this, that they figured out what the health condition was that was keeping him from being able to gain weight and that was causing him to miss time and all of that, because he missed a lot of practices in 2020, 2021. And the question was he going to be able to stay healthy? And they figured out mid-season, I think it was 2021, they figured out what it was. And all of a sudden they figured out how to treat it. And then he gained a lot more weight in those next couple of years and was able to stay on the field up until the very end of 2023. So, credit to them on that. But that health issue is part of why he was not as big as he might have gotten. So, and, again, when they discovered it, that was a turning point for Florida State's program, because if that had never been fixed, you're talking about a guy that couldn't take enough reps in practice. He wasn't healthy enough to practice as often as he should have. 2022, 2023, that changed. And that's what you got. All right. Well, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and split this episode. I'm going to go way longer than one episode should be. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap here and just take the rest of this mailbag and split it into either one or two more episodes. But until then, this is Unconquered with Doc Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. I am especially grateful for those of you at the Dynasty level. That is Brian Leininger, Dave Blair, Jack Horton, Jonathan Kennedy, Lee Caswell, Travis Smith, and Tyler Kashishki. You all are far more generous than I deserve. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.